Dr. Michael Edelstein is a clinical psychologist and the author of 3-Minute Therapy, Change Your Thinking, Change Your Life. Michael, thank you very much for speaking with me. I think when most people are going to speak with a psychologist or a psychiatrist in an informal situation, they can be a little bit nervous as to what will be said, what will be thought of them. But far from it, I'm very excited to be speaking with you. I'm fascinated by 3-Minute Therapy. It's my understanding that really you're from the cognitive behavioral therapy school, which arguably is the most successful school of therapy. I think most people are familiar with it. For example, the idea of conquering a phobia by confronting your fear and then maybe developing a new relationship with that object of fear and feeling differently about it in the future. But in 3-Minute Therapy, you introduce us to REBT, which is Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, which I understand was developed by the psychologist Albert Ellis and really revolutionized cognitive behavioral therapy. So please, if you could describe what were Albert Ellis's influences. I understand he was influenced by the Greek philosophers, which I find fascinating because at a difficult period in my life I found reading the Stoics to be good at helping me distance myself from the problem, thinking more rationally and objectively about things. And also I understand that REBT works in 6 stages, easy to remember, so A, B, C, D, E, F. So please, if you could explain all of this for me.
Okay, sure. And Rick, your description of rational emotive behavior therapy as a cognitive behavior therapy is exactly accurate. Albert Ellis devised rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT, in the 50s, and that was the first cognitive behavior therapy, and that spawned the many cognitive behavior therapies that came after that. Aaron Beck, Donald Meichenbaum, many other therapists and writers had their own variation, but it was based fundamentally in Albert Ellis's REBT. You asked about influences on Albert Ellis, and you're exactly right, Rick. The Stoics were a great influence, particularly Epictetus and some of the other Stoic philosophers. Albert Ellis read widely on philosophy, and he was also influenced by Lao Tzu and some other philosophers, and also some psychologists. Karen Horney, Alfred Adler were among the influences. And he put it all together and came up with REBT, which, as you correctly said, is a very effective, efficient, and getting more popular form of therapy. Now, one thing you mentioned about phobias and confronting your fears, REBT takes a 2-pronged attack on emotional and psychological problems. One is behavioral, and confronting your fears is a behavioral approach. So if you're afraid of riding elevators, for example, then you can confront that and ride the elevator 50 times a day. Or if you have a fear of flying, fly as much as you can. Or go over bridges again and again and again, if that's your fear. So one aspect is the behavioral, but the other aspect, which in a sense is more important, is the cognitive. And the idea there is that our emotional problems and our behavioral problems don't come from situations themselves. It doesn't come from a rickety elevator or a bridge that collapsed in the earthquake, if you have a fear of going over bridges, but it comes from our thinking about those situations. What we tell ourselves, the ideas, attitudes, views, opinions, notions in our head causes our emotions and causes our behaviors, whether they're reasonable emotions and behaviors or unreasonable, it all emanates from our thinking. So that gives us a lot of power. That means if we have anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, shame, any emotion that's not helping us and disturbing us, then if we identify the thinking that's causing it and change that thinking, then our emotions will change and our behavior will change to the good. And if we're getting poor results, such as anxiety or addictions, then that in itself is a red flag saying our thinking is off. Our thinking is not in line with reality.
I understand in the 6 steps, the A, B, C, D, E, F, really the crux of it seems to be the B, seems to be the belief. What seems to be most important is if you are thinking, I must do X, Y, and Z in order to be worthy of the love and companionship of people in my life, or people must be nice to me. And if they're not, then I feel somehow justified in being anger or getting, even rage. Or, for instance, I say I must have a carefree life. Really, it's, as you just said, often an irrational belief about something in the world around us. Doesn't necessarily have to be irrational, but is it most often irrational?
Well, I would say that it's always an irrational belief of the kind you're describing, an absolute, a demand, a must, a should, a supposed to, or have to, that leads to emotional disturbance. And so if you're feeling anxious or depressed or angry, and you'd like to identify your thinking, you can look at 3 main demands, 3 main musts that people have that cause emotional disturbance. The first is the one you identified, Rick, a demand on oneself, which takes the form of, because I prefer to do well and get approval, and because it would be disadvantageous to do poorly and be criticized, I absolutely must, I have to do well and get approval. And if I don't, I'm no good, I'm worthless, I'm a rotten failure. So that's the first demand, and that leads to anxiety, depression, and guilt. The second area of demands is not on oneself, but on others, and that takes the form of, you must do well and treat me well because I prefer it, and if you don't, this proves you're no good, you're worthless, you deserve to roast in hell, and I've just appointed myself your roaster, so I get angry, resentful, vindictive toward you. The third and final demand or must is not a demand on people, oneself or others, but it's a demand on the impersonal conditions of one's life. A demand that because I prefer life be fair, easy, and hassle-free, it absolutely must be. My life must be free of hassles and difficulty, frustration, and discomfort. And if it's not, then life is no good. I have to be miserable forever, and I might as well dig myself a hole and jump in it. So all emotional disturbance comes down to one of those 3 main musts. Then once you identify it, and as you said, the B in the ABCDF model, which I call the 3-minute exercise, that model, the B is the irrational belief, the must or should, then you go on to question it, and that's D, disputing or questioning the irrational belief. And that's a simple process. You just take what you have at B, the irrational belief, and you put why or what is the evidence in front of it. You turn into a little scientist and you look for the evidence. What is the evidence? Where is it written or etched in stone that I absolutely must get your approval and that I'm no good if you think I am? And if you really think about it, you'll see there's evidence why it would be preferable to get your approval because it will give me advantages. It will make life easier. But there's no reason why I must have advantages in life. Life consists of advantages and disadvantages, pleasures and displeasures, satisfactions and dissatisfactions. There's no reason I have to have a charmed life and always have the positive side of it. So then you show yourself there's no reason for the must. It's a fiction, just like Santa Claus. There's no evidence for it, a fiction that people have in their heads. And then if I question that must, thinking again and again and again, and show myself over and over again. There's no evidence for it. There's evidence for my preference and my goals, no evidence that I have to do what I prefer to do or why life has to be the way I would like it to be. Then you're cured. Then you're over your emotional disturbance.
It's really fascinating. I find that the political implications of this, it just seems so very obvious to me. The reason for that, I think, is primarily I get messages from people who feel that there is something wrong with the way we do society, and also maybe they've got some difficult circumstances in their own life. So that they'll maybe go to drugs, or perhaps they will go to some sort of addiction, something that makes them feel good. But politically speaking, I think then they can be drawn towards socialism. They buy into the idea that um, uh, they must have an easier life, a carefree life, and therefore other people must be providing something for them. And it seems so very simple. It seems like an easy pill to take, a quick fix, and also it seems like a way of venting all their frustration about circumstances in their life. Whereas, of course, with libertarianism, what we both believe, we say, no, no one must do anything. People are free. They can voluntarily, interact, but no one has to do anything. We're not supposed to be using force against anyone else for some rights someone has just invented off the top of their head that they must have. Is it as simple as I'm making out, or have I missed something? Is there an application like that?
No, I think that's a very good analysis that often in the entitlement mentality comes from because I prefer to have an easier life, as you said, therefore I must have an easier life, and you owe it to me because you're doing better than I am. So this gives me the entitlement. There has been evidence, Rick, that criminals often have a high self-esteem. And the self-esteem idea comes from this must. I must have an easy life, and that because I'm such a good person, and that's the self-esteem idea. I'm a good person, or I'm a bad person is high self-esteem or low self-esteem. I'm a good person, therefore I must have an easier life. So I'm better than you. So it's okay if I steal, rob, and kidnap you in order to get what I deserve. So it ties into the self-esteem notion that comes from musts and shoulds. I must do well and get approval, and if I do, I'm a good person. Another problem that's political is nationalism, that people, just like people, some sports fans, for example, get ebullient and euphoric when their team wins and depressed when their team loses. They're over-identifying with their team, and people over-identify with the state. I must do well, and I am the state, and the state is me, and we are doing things that really just the government is doing, but the myth is we are doing it. So that's me, and if the state does well, then I'm doing well, and I'm a good person, and as I must be. So there's that tie into it also. So I think if people gave up their musts and shoulds, there'd be less crime, there'd be less nationalism, less statism, and things would work out not only well for people, but for the society as a whole.
It's fascinating. I was talking very recently with James Fallon, professor at the University of California, and he was explaining to me that libertarians tend to be people who have a more cold cognitive kind of brain, and socialists tend to also, they don't predominantly use that same cold rational part of their brain, especially when thinking about ethics. They tend to think primarily, predominantly with the more emotional side of the brain. Would you say that libertarians, being more rationalistic in their thinking, we're sort of safeguarded in thinking in an unrealistic way about the world. And therefore, would you also say then that it's more difficult to conduct this sort of therapy with someone who has set in their mind a particular political ideology?
Uh, I wouldn't say that's the case. And I do work with libertarians since I'm known in the libertarian movement. So I get clients who are libertarians, some quite well known libertarians. And I don't think that because they have a particular ideology that either exacerbates or limits emotional disturbance. Because the idea here, Rick, is not so much your ideology, your morality, or your objectives in life, but rather it's whether you put musts and shoulds to them. So you can have strong ideologies and be passionate about them, but have them as very strong preferences and desires, not as absolute demands. And the libertarians that I've worked with overall have been more reasonable in general in their life than the population in general, which is a problem for my practice because they don't stay as long as some of the other people who are more disturbed. They generally get the message pretty quickly and start applying it pretty quickly. And so then I go out and do some more marketing to get more clients. But as far as the cold, rational aspect of it, that's really more of a sociological question about libertarians in general. And most of my friends are libertarians, so I could tell you about them. And most of my friends are warm people, empathic people. So I haven't noticed on that level that libertarians tend to be colder or more calculating in ways than other people. Although I do notice that the mainstream parties tend to cater more to emotions and try to speak to emotions more than principles. So maybe there is something to be said for that theory.
And whilst we're on the subject of libertarians, I have to speak with you. I can't not speak with you about Ayn Rand's idea about self-esteem. It seems to me, I don't know a tremendous amount about this, I have to admit, but it seems to me that the idea that Randians have, or objectivists, I'm sorry, is that I can set my own goals, if you like. I can set my own musts, even my own sort of goals. I mean, I can pat myself on the back for those sorts of things. That to me doesn't seem to agree with human nature. It doesn't seem to comport with the idea, or rather the way our brain works. You know, normal human brain analyzes group expectations, and we are social animals. And it seems to me to be very, well, ironically, not very objective, not very empirical. Please, if you could help me understand the self-esteem a bit better.
Well, are you saying that objectivists say I can set my own goals and that's really not in accord with human nature?
Well, I'm saying to sort of dismiss everything else, or rather to dismiss the thoughts and the processes going on in our brains that really feels something about, or at least wants to try and compute what group expectations are and what's going on in society.
Well,
Just to sort of pretend that doesn't exist. To me, sorry, go on.
yeah, I agree. I see your point there. And I do think it's an interaction. And I think Adam Smith talks a lot about this in the theory of moral sentiments, that we can set our own goals in a sense, but we are influenced by our society, the people around us, our genetic influences, and other things. So I think in terms of setting our own goals, it's an interaction between all these influences and our own evaluation of them. One of the strongest influences, I think stronger than the people around us, is our genetic predispositions. I think most people have a goal to be happy, to enjoy their life, and to get along in a social group. And I think that's largely genetically inspired rather than societally or individually inspired exclusively. One of my main problems with Ayn Rand's views, and Nathaniel Branden, who promulgated a lot of this, is on her idea of self-esteem. And she was a big, she and Branden were big proponents of the idea of self-esteem, high self-esteem, and those kinds of things. And I think that that's a failed concept because if you look at what self-esteem is, to esteem means to think highly of. So self-esteem means to think highly of oneself. Now, why do people think highly of themselves, Nathaniel Branden and Rand included? Because they do well in certain areas of life. So their equation is, I do well at this, I've written 20 books, and I'm a great lecturer, and Ayn Rand loves me, or did love me, and therefore I'm a good person. So there's some truth in there, but there's a falsehood also. The truth is evaluating your behavior. So if I wrote 20 books, that's good. I did well at that. And if Ayn Rand loves me, maybe that's good because I wanted to love her and she loves me, so that's good. But so that's fine. It's important to evaluate your actions, performances. But when you overgeneralize to your total self as a person, your being, your personhood, therefore I'm a good person, then you're in trouble and create emotional disturbance. And that overgeneralization is a problem on three grounds. It's empirically false, it's logically false, and it's pragmatically false. Otherwise, it's a great idea. And it's empirically false because there's no data in the real world. There's nothing that shows you that someone's a good person or a bad person. All you see is people doing things, people doing good things, bad things, neutral things, nothing at all. So you can observe their actions. You can see someone playing tennis, for example, and winning the tennis match, but then they don't spring a halo and wings showing that they're a good person. They're still the same fallible, mistake-making human they were before the tennis match. And the same with a bad person. You can see someone committing crimes and robbing and stealing, but after they do that, they're still just an imperfect human acting imperfectly or acting very, very imperfectly, but it's all about their actions. So the moral of this is rate your behaviors. That's important because if you decide you're doing well, then you want to figure out how to maintain that good behavior. And if you decide you're doing poorly, then normally you want to figure out how to do better. So it's important to rate your behaviors.
Yeah.
But don't overgeneralize to your total self. There's no point to it. It doesn't do any good. Now, it's illogical because it doesn't follow that if you do well, therefore you're a good person. That's an overgeneralization. It's a non sequitur. If you do well, we can conclude you did well, or maybe we can even conclude that you won Wimbledon and you're the best tennis player in the world right now. But that changes. People are a process, not a product. They're always changing. And it's unpragmatic. It doesn't work because it leads to a number of problems. While we're on tennis, John McEnroe wrote a book called You Cannot Be Serious, which is what he used to tell the judges when they called a ball badly. And he said in the book that when he was going up the ranks and was getting closer to Wimbledon, he got more and more anxious and more depressed because he kept worrying, what if I blow it this time? You know, when I'm really in the limelight. And that was about his ego. I must continue to do well. And because so far I'm a great person. And if I don't, if I fail, I'm a rotten person in the basement. So that led to his anxiety. So it doesn't really work to have this whole concept of self-esteem and evaluate yourself in relation to it. So those are some of the problems with Ayn Rand's self-esteem.
The other thing I want to talk to you about is libertarians who burn out. So what I mean by that is libertarians who have been maybe activists even, working towards it in some way, promoting libertarian principles, the idea of freedom, even if it's just, classical liberal principles generally. It doesn't even have to be in the political sphere. And after a time, they stop noticing any sort of results from the work, and they feel disheartened, and then they leave it behind. I mean, I'm younger, so I can't judge, but to me, it doesn't seem to be about that. I would agree with Walter Block, our mutual friend, when he said to me, I feel that the ideas of liberty are glorious and they're worth talking about and sharing and fighting for, because it's fun. He enjoys it. He's really full of life when he does those things, and that's how I feel. It's a tremendous influence to me. So the idea that we can have great expectations and that huge numbers of people should come to this movement, it doesn't really seem to make sense to me, and it doesn't really seem to comport with the socio-biological factors you were just mentioning, the genetics, what we're like, what we really think, or how we think even. So if you could speak about that as well.
Oh, sure. Just a note about what you said about Walter Block. Walter has said that if he was on an island and had no contact with people at all and wasn't going to have contact with people, he'd spend his time writing articles and books on libertarianism because that's his love and that's his passion. So that's at one end of the spectrum, and the other end is what you identified, Rick, and that is libertarians who have musts and shoulds. We must win right now. We must abolish the state next week, and then they burn out because of those musts, rather than having a more long-range perspective on things. Murray Rothbard talks about that also. He said he's a pessimist in the short run, but an optimist in the long run. So it's important to take that long-term perspective to avoid burnout. But if you have that demand, things have to change right now, and I must see the results of all my work. And if I don't, it means it's a hopeless case. Then that's going to lead to burnout.
If you had just one brief message to libertarians who maybe feel doubtful about the future, that they're concerned to, what if I burn out? What if I stop really caring about these things? What would you want to say? What would be the crux of your message?
Well, the crux of my message is the message that I gave at a capitalism and morality conference a few years ago. And the title of my talk was Emotional Freedom in One Lesson. And the one lesson is give up your demands, give up your musts and shoulds, and reinforce your preferences, work toward your goals and values, but give up any demands you have and global evaluations along the way. So that would be my main message. Just as in libertarianism, we say the toxic part of society is the state, we'd all be better off without a state. Well, psychologically, the toxic part of our psychology is the demands, the musts and shoulds. We'd all be better off without these demands. Also, I'd like to mention that I do have a website called 3minutetherapy.com. 3 is spelled out, 3minutetherapy.com. It's the name of my book, 3 Minute Therapy. And in there, you could get a lot more information about my approach.
I understand you met Walter Block through playing chess. Is that correct? Had you also met Murray Rothbard at that time? What was the situation?
Well, Walter and I had a mutual friend who we knew through REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. This was in the 70s, because we were all clients of Albert Ellis.
Wow.
And then this mutual friend who was a client of Albert Ellis knew me and knew Walter, but Walter and I didn't know each other. So he introduced us, since we both lived in Brooklyn and enjoyed chess. So we spent a lot of our weekends playing chess, and in between chess games, we debate politics. And I was a liberal Democrat then. And I won most of the chess games, and Walter won the political debates. So that's how I became a libertarian. And then he introduced me to a number of libertarians in the area, like Murray Rothbard. And I had some meals with Murray, and I observed some of his classes at Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, where he taught at the time. And one night, Walter and I took Murray Rothbard to Albert Ellis's home, and the four of us got together. And the one thing that Murray and Albert Ellis had in common was bashing Ayn Rand. So,
Oh, really?
Yes. So Albert Ellis wrote a song parodying Ayn Rand called "Rationality is the Only Thing for Me."
Very
Mark
good.
talked about his play "Mozart Was a Red." You familiar
Oh,
with that?
yes. Yeah, I am. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I think it's...
And so that was some of my experiences with Walter and some other libertarians.
Oh, that must have been amazing. I would love to have been a fly on the wall, as they say, to
Yeah.
see these four great minds together. And it's been a real honor and a pleasure to speak with you. I can't thank you enough for your very valuable time. But,
Okay. Thanks very much for a great interview and very good questions. And I will look forward to doing it again.